The last thing my father said about the company was not a number, not a warning, not even a name. It was a sentence so plain I almost missed how much of my life would have to carry it. Don't let him make me disappear. At the time, I thought he meant memory. I thought he meant grief. I thought he meant the ordinary fear dying people have when they realize the world will keep moving after they stop. I did not understand yet that he meant contracts. Letterhead. Ownership. The name on the glass. The framed photograph in the lobby. The story of who built the place. My father was asking me not to let my uncle steal him twice. Once in life. And once on paper. He failed at the first one. I spent the next 10 years making sure he failed at the second. My name is Hannah Mercer. The man who built Mercer Industrial Supply with one rented warehouse bay, a used truck, and a level of stubbornness most people would have called foolish if it hadn't eventually become profitable, was my father. Daniel, the man who sat beside his hospital bed and nodded through every prayer circle and every family meeting, then took the company before the sympathy flowers were even dry, was my Uncle Richard. And the day I walked into his office as the new owner, the first thing I noticed was that he still had my father's pen on the desk. If this story reaches into something real in you, subscribe now. Some betrayals are not explosions. They are signatures. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, where winters smelled like furnace heat and wet asphalt, and where my father's business sat in an industrial corridor of low brick buildings, chain-link fences, loading docks, and forklifts moving like determined insects from dawn to dark. Mercer Industrial Supply was not the sort of company anyone outside our city would have admired on sight. It sold fittings, valves, fasteners, O's, gaskets, industrial sealants, machine components, and specialty parts to local manufacturers and contractors. There was nothing glamorous about it. That was one of the reasons my father loved it. He trusted things that did not need performance. He liked work boots, plain coffee, invoices paid on time, and promises that survived weather. He started the company at 29. Long before I was born. After getting laid off from a manufacturing plant and deciding, in the sort of unphotogenic act of courage that builds whole towns, that if he was going to work that hard for the rest of his life, he would rather own the risk himself. He never spoke about it romantically. He didn't call himself an entrepreneur, didn't give speeches, didn't talk about legacy. He just worked. The first warehouse bay had a leaking roof and a heater that failed every third winter day. The first desk was a scarred metal relic someone from church had given him after an office renovation. The first truck had more rust than paint and a passenger door that only opened from the inside, if you kicked the lower hinge first. My mother, Teresa, used to laugh when she told those stories. She handled the books from home in the early years, while my father delivered inventory himself, unloaded shipments, and spent evenings at the kitchen table filling out purchase orders with ink on his fingers. By the time I was old enough to remember the business, it had grown into a 2-building operation with a front office, a warehouse, a machine room, and a reputation for being the place that could find what nobody else had in stock if you were willing to wait 10 extra minutes and drink whatever coffee was sitting on the hot plate. I loved it for reasons children rarely know how to explain properly. I loved the smell first. Rubber, cardboard, dust, oil, paper, cold metal in winter, and burnt coffee. I loved the way my father changed when he was there, not softer. Exactly. But more exact. More alive. More like the cleanest version of himself. At home he was affectionate and steady, At the company, he was focused in a way that made the whole building feel like an extension of his body. I loved that men in work jackets nodded at him with real respect. Not social respect. Not church respect. Earned respect. The kind built through years of solving the right problem at the right hour for the right price, without acting like you were a hero for doing your job. Sometimes on Saturdays, he took me with him. I'd sit at the front desk on a stool too high for my legs to reach the floor, sorting colored pens, flipping through old product catalogs, or pretending to answer phones that never rang while he moved through the warehouse, checking counts or talking with customers who came in desperate because a part had failed somewhere and downtime was costing them money by the minute. Around noon, he'd bring in sandwiches wrapped in wax paper from a deli nearby and say something like, "Everything in this place looks boring until the right thing breaks somewhere else." That sentence stayed with me. So did almost everything else. The old green filing cabinets, the stained concrete near the loading bay, the scratched conference table where sales reps sat, making promises they only occasionally kept, the framed black and white photo in the lobby of my father standing beside the company's first truck with his sleeves rolled up, and that startled expression men get when effort starts becoming identity. My mother died when I was 14. Ovarian cancer. Fast. Cruel. The kind that turns family time into before and after with almost no warning. Until then, she had run the administrative side of the company with the sort of invisible competence wives in family businesses rarely get properly credited for. Payroll. Invoices. Holiday baskets. Customer birthdays. Supply orders. Filing. Accounts receivable. Sympathy cards. Lunch for meetings. Coffee filters. Toner. And the 1,000 tiny acts that make a business feel stable from the inside, while one person is carrying half the structure silently. When she got sick, the house and the office both changed. At home, the air smelled like pills, broth, and fatigue. At the office, my father became quieter, more inward, and more dependent on whoever looked available enough to step into the gaps my mother's absence opened. That was when my Uncle Richard became more important than he should have. Richard was my father's younger brother by 4 years. If my father was substance, Richard was packaging. Better suits, smoother voice, whiter teeth. He had drifted through a series of careers that all sounded impressive for about 6 months and disappointing after a year. Insurance sales, commercial leasing, a logistics consulting venture that existed mostly in PowerPoint, a regional equipment brokerage arrangement that collapsed under the weight of his optimism and someone else's paperwork. Somehow, none of those failures ever attached to him in family lore the way they would have attached to anyone else. Because Richard was charming. And charm acts like solvent in families, too eager to confuse charisma with harmlessness. When my mother got sick, Richard began showing up more often. At first it felt natural. He helped with vendor lunches, took clients to baseball games, said he could sit in on sales meetings if my father needed to be at the hospital. He had exactly the right tone for every room, practical in business spaces, tender in hospital spaces, lightly joking around me, so I would not harden against him too early. That last part I only recognized later. At the time, I was too busy grieving, too young to understand that a man can stand beside your pain and still be measuring the room for leverage. After my mother died, the company became more than work to my father. It became order, the one part of life where effort still had visible return. He worked longer, slept less, trusted too much in practical routines to keep him from looking directly at the scale of what he had lost. And because the company had grown enough by then to need visible leadership as well as operational stamina, Richard drifted naturally upward inside it. That was how everybody described it. Naturally, as if there were no force involved, As if men like my uncle did not spend their whole lives arranging themselves near opportunity until others mistook ambition for gravity. By the time I graduated from college, Richard had become the public-facing half of Mercer Industrial Supply. My father still did the actual thinking, vendor strategy, cash flow, instincts, client retention, pricing discipline, inventory judgment. Every part of the business that required knowledge, rather than volume, still ran through him. But Richard was increasingly the man at lunches, conferences, chamber dinners, and handshakes in parking lots. He called himself a growth partner once at a family barbecue, and my father rolled his eyes so hard I nearly laughed soda through my nose. That eye roll should have warned me my father saw more than he said. He just did not see enough soon enough. I loved my father for many reasons. One of them was that he never lied to me about work. Not the hard parts, not the money parts, not the male ego parts. As a teenager, I heard more about gross margin and payment terms than most girls in my zip code. And by the time I hit college, I could identify 3 kinds of bad debt by listening to the way my father sighed into the phone. He didn't force the company on me. That mattered. He never spoke like certain men do when they have daughters and no sons suited to inherit a business. He never turned me into emotional succession planning. He just let me watch. Let me learn. Let me ask questions. Let me sit in the edge of meetings if I happened to be around during school breaks. When I was 19 and helping him file documents in the office after hours, he said, "You don't owe this place loyalty because it has my name on it." I looked up from the folders. "That sounds like a trick." He smiled. "It's not. If you build your own life, I'll be proud of that. If you come back here one day, I'll be proud of that too. I just don't want you confusing inheritance with obligation." That sentence became painfully ironic later. At 26, I was living in Columbus and working in procurement for a regional logistics firm. I liked the work because it made sense. Numbers, contracts, timelines, supplier reliability, transportation risk, cost pressure, negotiated leverage, quiet power, invisible architecture. If operations work gets done well, nobody applauds. If it gets done badly, entire systems wobble. I found something soothing in that. Around the same time, I had someone in my life my father liked almost immediately. His name was Adam. We met at a supply chain conference after a panel on warehouse automation got derailed by an executive who confused certainty with expertise. Adam leaned over halfway through and whispered, "If this man says ecosystem one more time, I'm charging him consulting fees." I laughed before I could stop myself. He worked in manufacturing finance. Wore his shirt sleeves rolled to the exact same point every time, and had a dry wit that made rooms feel less crowded. He did not overtalk, did not overperform. He remembered things, followed through, asked questions that revealed actual attention instead of rehearsed curiosity. My father trusted him almost immediately, which told me something before I was ready to admit how much. Men like my father are not dazzled by charm because they have spent their lives negotiating past it. They trust steadiness, detail, and the absence of self-advertisement. Adam had all 3. By the time we had been together 2 years, my father was calling him not kid, but Adam, which in Daniel Mercer language was practically a public blessing. Then my father got sick, pancreatic cancer, aggressive, late enough at diagnosis that every medical conversation sounded like it had already accepted a boundary nobody wanted to name too clearly. The hospital smelled like hand sanitizer, weak coffee, artificial lemon cleaning spray, and dread. That is the scent profile of serious illness in America. My father hated every minute of it. He hated being spoken around, hated uncertainty, hated the way everyone's face changed when test results were delayed, hated the thin gowns, the temperature of the rooms, the helplessness, and the way everybody started using words like comfort and stage and options and voices, so gentle they became insulting. Richard was there for all of it, at every major appointment, every family conference, every waiting room coffee run. He took notes, touched my father's shoulder at the right moments, told the staff he was helping keep things stable at the company. This is how thieves in good shoes approach tragedy. They arrive looking useful. At first, I was grateful. That is hard to admit now. But it is true. I was driving back and forth from Columbus, missing sleep, trying to help my father navigate treatment choices while also managing my own job and the emotional nausea of watching the strongest man I knew get weaker by the week. Richard handled client lunches, kept the front office calm, told employees not to worry, fielded supplier questions, presented himself as continuity. At the time, continuity felt merciful. That is the problem with manipulative relatives during family crises. They rarely act against your interests loudly enough for you to refuse their help early. They make themselves indispensable first, then expensive, then dangerous. The first time something felt truly wrong, it was not dramatic. It was a document. It is almost always a document. One Sunday afternoon, I found my father in his den at home. It was late March, rain tapping against the windows, a church casserole cooling untouched on the kitchen counter. The whole house smelled like broth, dust, and medication. My father was in his recliner, wearing a gray cardigan, despite the heat being on, reading glasses low on his nose, a folder spread across his lap with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not confusion. Fatigue thick enough to blur caution. "What's that?" I asked. He looked up slowly. "Richard wants me to sign some temporary operating documents." I sat down on the sofa opposite him. "Temporary how?" He handed me the folder. I remember exactly what it felt like in my hands. Slightly warm. Cheap legal paper. The texture of something designed to survive signatures. I read the first page, then the second, then the third. The language was polished enough to sound protective. Interim authority. Continuity planning. Emergency management power. Operational discretion. Safeguards in case of incapacity. But beneath the politeness of the wording was structure. Decision control. Voting rights under triggering conditions. Accelerated authority transfer, tied to health decline. Board protection language broad enough to become permanent, if nobody fought it quickly enough. It was not a handover. It was a grab with good punctuation. "This isn't temporary," I said. My father rubbed his jaw. "Richard says it's standard." That sentence made something in me go cold. Richard says whatever makes Richard safer. He sighed. I don't have energy for a war over every paper that crosses my lap. There are few things more painful than watching a competent man become vulnerable to exactly the wrong person because illness has turned every decision into labor. I moved to the edge of the sofa. "Then don't fight. Delay. Let me have it reviewed." He looked tired enough to say yes immediately. That scared me more than if he had argued. "All right," he said. "Take it." Then, after a pause, he smiled faintly and added, "You always did know where the knives are." That became one of the last real jokes he ever made. I took the folder straight back to Columbus that night and dropped it on Adam's kitchen table like it was radioactive. We read through it side by side under yellow lamplight while takeout went cold and snowmelt dripped from the gutters outside. Adam called a corporate attorney friend before I even finished my second pass. By the next afternoon, we had a cleaner answer than my instinct had needed to know I was right. Predatory. That was the word. Predatory continuity structuring disguised as compassionate planning. I drove back to Dayton the following morning with legal notes, a second opinion, and an anger in me so focused it made every other emotion feel ornamental. Richard was in my father's kitchen when I arrived. Of course he was. Coffee in hand. Shirt perfect. Voice ready. He looked up when I came in, smiled lightly, and said, "Hannah, good timing. Your dad's resting." I set the folder on the counter between us. "Don't hand him another paper unless I review it first." His smile changed by maybe half an inch. "Just enough. I beg your pardon? You heard me." He took a sip of coffee before answering, which I later understood was deliberate. A pause that framed me as already emotional. "This is a difficult season," he said. "And your father needs less agitation? Not more suspicion." There it was. The pivot. Challenge the mechanism, and suddenly you are the unstable one. He also needs someone not trying to take control of his business while he's on pain medication. Richard actually laughed, softly, as if I were sweetly naive. "You've always been bright, Hannah, but you don't understand how fragile companies become when leadership weakens." "No," I said. "I understand exactly how fragile ownership becomes when family mistakes access for entitlement." For 1 second, the mask slipped. Only a second. But enough. Enough for me to see irritation underneath the smoothness. Then my father called weakly from the den, and Richard's face reset into concern so quickly it almost made me nauseous. That is what people rarely describe properly about manipulative relatives. The speed. How fast they can move from predation to performance and back again. My father did not sign those documents. Not then. But cancer is not a courtroom where one good objection wins the whole case. Over the next 4 months, he declined hard. Weight dropping. Pain increasing. Appointments multiplying. Hospitalizations. Long fluorescent afternoons in infusion suites. Nights in rooms where the air was too cold and smelled like bleach and old coffee and other people's fear. Through all of it, Richard stayed close. Close enough to become operationally normal. Close enough that employees stopped thinking of him as temporary. Close enough that the accountant started copying him first on some threads instead of my father. Close enough that his version of events had time to age into ordinary. That is how power moves in family businesses. Not with one clean theft. With familiarity. With repeated presence. With enough small accommodations that by the time the major grab comes, half the room has already adjusted to the shape of it. My father and I had a conversation 3 weeks before he died that I have replayed more times than any other. He was at home in the den again. Thinner than I thought possible. A blanket over his knees. Afternoon light making everything in the room look softer than it deserved to. He had just finished a difficult week and looked emptied out. The oxygen concentrator in the corner made a low sound like tired breathing. We talked about the company. Not sentimentally. That was never his style. He asked about vendor lead times in my sector. Asked whether regional manufacturing consolidation would squeeze smaller supply houses harder over the next decade. Asked whether I thought too many mid-sized owners were overborrowing because money had been easy for too long. That was him all the way to the end. Still thinking through structure while his own body was becoming fragile around him. Then he got quiet, and finally said, "If Richard stays near this place after I'm gone, he'll say he's protecting it." I waited. He won't be. That was the closest my father ever got to fully naming him. I said, "Then don't leave him room." He shut his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, I could see the truth there. Not weakness. Not denial. Just the devastating awareness of a man realizing he may already have left too much room by trying to survive. I've signed more than I should have while tired. he said. That sentence hit harder than the diagnosis, because it meant the battle had already moved further downfield than I had known. I asked what exactly he had signed. He couldn't remember all of it. That terrified me. Not because he was mentally gone. He wasn't. Because exhaustion and medication and fear had blurred his tolerance for paperwork at exactly the moment someone nearby was benefiting from it. Then came the sentence that started all of this. Don't let him make me disappear. He was looking not at me then, but at the office wall across the room where one of the company award plaques hung crooked because no one had fixed it since his last hospital stay. I thought he meant memory. He meant documentation. That was the day I stopped hoping the company would simply remain decent after he died and started understanding I would need a plan bigger than grief. He died in November. Rain all day. Gray sky. The hospice room smelled like warmed blankets, plastic tubing, and that strange institutional air that never fully loses the scent of previous sorrow. I was there. So was my father? So was Richard. Adam drove in from Columbus and arrived an hour before the end. Coat wet from the parking lot. Jaw tight from trying not to show panic. He held my hand. My father squeezed mine once. Then Adam's once. And then his breathing changed. The body knows before language does when someone is leaving. Bytrze. 47 a.m. He was gone. I remember the silence after the machines were turned off more vividly than any prayer that followed. I remember the shape of the rain on the window, the nurse speaking too gently. My own coat still damp from the dash through the parking lot. The weightless nausea of standing up and realizing the world had not had the decency to end with him. Then Richard put a hand on my shoulder and said, "I'll take care of everything." That sentence should have cracked the linoleum. Instead, I stood there numb enough to let it slide past me. That is grief's most humiliating function sometimes. It makes you temporarily available to people you would have challenged cleanly any other day. The funeral happened in a blur of navy wool. Casserole tray. Folding chairs. Church perfume. An old man who told me my father was one of the last decent ones, as if decency were a species already too endangered to protect My mother had been gone long enough by then that all eyes kept drifting to me as the visible remainder of his line. Richard gave the eulogy. Of course he did. Calm voice. Measured pauses. Stories selected with precision. Enough warmth to sound grieving. Enough involvement to sound essential. If you had not known us, you would have thought he had been my father's right hand by destiny instead of by opportunity. By the time we got to coffee hour, 3 different people had thanked him for keeping things together. That was the first sign the theft was already underway in public language. 3 days later, he asked me to meet at the office with the accountant. I went because I still thought the fight, if one came, would be about succession optics, not about having already lost control in legal structure. The office smelled exactly the same as always. Dust. Cardboard. Copiertoner. Stale coffee. That nearly undid me. Grief is unbearable in places that refuse to change scent. Richard sat at the conference table with a leather folio in front of him and the expression of a man about to explain difficult realities, no one but he was brave enough to say aloud. The accountant, Morris, looked sick. There are few useful signs in life more reliable than the face of an honest accountant who wants no part of the room he has just entered. Richard started with this. There are things your father intended that he didn't fully discuss with you. That sentence began the theft. By the end of that meeting, I learned that months earlier while ill, medicated, under escalating stress, and increasingly reliant on Richard, operationally, my father had executed a revised partnership and succession package. Not the spring documents I had blocked. A different package. Cleaner. More strategic. More dangerous. Richard had positioned himself as controlling partner under a continuity and protection framework. With valuation mechanics and buyout triggers so lopsided that my father's estate, which should have held leverage through years of sweat equity and existing ownership structure, was effectively boxed into a payout far below what the business was actually worth if pressure conditions were triggered. Pressure conditions had, naturally, already been triggered. It was legal. That is important. Not morally defensible. Not honorable. But legal. Family theft with signatures ages differently than ordinary theft. It makes people around you impatient with your pain, because the documents create the illusion of fairness for anyone who prefers not to look too closely. I spent 6 months fighting it. Lawyers, probate counsel, forensic accounting reviews, valuation dispute, phone calls that started politely and ended in that dead tone professionals use when they need you to understand they are charging by the hour for your grief now. Every week I drove between Columbus and Dayton with a laptop full of scanned signatures, medical timelines, annotated partnership clauses, and legal memos that all said versions of the same devastating thing. Your father may have been pressured. Your father may have been tired. Your father may have trusted the wrong man. But absent provable incapacity at the exact moment of execution, this will be very difficult to unwind. That phrase, difficult to unwind, became the soundtrack of that year. Not impossible, just expensive, which in American legal language often means impossible for the injured person and manageable for the man already holding the building. I watched my father's life become case structure. His pain became timing. His trust became leverage. And because Richard had been careful enough not to look greedy until the paperwork was already in place, everybody around us kept confusing my outrage with immaturity. He would say things like, "I know Hannah is emotional," or "Daniel wanted continuity," "Notre chaos," or my favorite, "The company has to survive the family's grief." That one almost made me admire him. It was so neat, so polished. He made his theft sound like stewardship, and my resistance sound like self-indulgence. The only thing more infuriating than a liar is a liar with business vocabulary. Morris, the accountant, was the only person in those months who looked openly ashamed of what had happened. He never contradicted Richard directly in the room. That would have required courage. But after one meeting, he walked me to the parking lot under a sky white with February cold and said, quietly, "Your father didn't understand how aggressive the control language would become after his death." I looked at him. "Did you?" He hesitated. "Long enough?" Then he said, "I understood enough to know he should have had separate counsel." That sentence kept me from ever forgiving him fully. Even though I still appreciated the honesty, he had known not enough to stop it, enough to flinch. That is the category a lot of adults live in when power shifts inside a family. They know enough to feel bad, not enough to risk themselves. In the end, I lost. Not emotionally. Actually, Richard took operational control. Majority ownership. The building. The key client relationships. The goodwill. The supply contracts. The lobby. The office. The right to tell the company's story. And eventually even the right to stand in rooms where people said my father's name and subtly route that name through his own. I got a settlement. A legal conclusion. A check that looked substantial to anyone who did not understand what had really been taken. My father's company no longer belonged to his line in any meaningful way. It belonged to his brother. The brother who had stood at his bedside and nodded like a mourner while positioning himself like a successor. For a year after that, I moved through my own life half present. Adam and I married that spring. The wedding was beautiful in the straightforward way. honest weddings often are. Warm lights, good food, no dramatic speeches. His mother cried. My Aunt Linda drank too much and apologized badly for how complicated everything had been. Which is what relatives say when they want absolution without content. I danced. I smiled. I loved him. All of that was real. And still, part of me felt hollow. There is a specific kind of emptiness that comes from being cheated not only out of something valuable, but out of the right story about it. If Richard had simply stolen cash, I would have known what had happened. Instead, he stole authorship. He turned himself into continuity and turned my father into a transition period. That is a harder thing to grieve. For months afterward, I dreamed in inventory. Aisles, shelving, purchase orders. My father's office door open and someone else inside. Sometimes in the dream, I could hear forklifts backing up. That steady warning beep. And I'd wake up convinced for 1/2 second that I could still get there in time. Adam was the one who put language to what I actually wanted. It was January. Snow coming sideways past the apartment windows in Columbus. Leftover chili on the stove. Both of us too tired to pretend adulthood felt noble. I had just spent 20 minutes cursing Richard in circles. Not because it made me feel better, but because some rage needs repetition before it loses its blood supply. Adam waited until I ran out of fresh nouns for my uncle. Then said, "You don't want revenge." I looked at him. "Yes, I do." He shook his head. "No. You want restoration with leverage." That stopped me. He set his bowl down and leaned back on the couch. "If this were just revenge, you'd want him humiliated tomorrow. You don't. What you want is for the company to return to the right story. You want your father restored structurally." That was exactly right. Not emotionally. Structurally. Once I had that sentence, the next decade of my life organized itself around it. I stopped fantasizing about dramatic confrontations. Stopped imagining shouting matches at Christmas. Stopped writing unsent letters to Richard in my head while brushing my teeth. I made a decision instead. I was going to outgrow him. Then buy back what mattered. Not quickly. Not theatrically. Correctly. The next 10 years looked boring from the outside. That is how the strongest revenge hides. I took a promotion in Columbus. Then another. Then a role overseeing multi-site procurement integration for a regional logistics and manufacturing group. My days became models. Supplier negotiations. Cost-risk analysis. Transition planning. Operational diagnostics. Due diligence support. And enough travel to make my suitcase smell permanently, like dry cleaner plastic and airport coffee. I got good at seeing weakness in businesses long before their owners did. Inventory carrying too long. Margin compression disguised as growth. Soft customer churn. Over-leveraged expansion. Succession risk masked by family optimism. Bad debt hiding under relationship language. I learned how lenders think. How boards stall. How men present control. How mediocre operators hide inside inherited loyalty for years before the numbers betray them. Adam rose to finance into acquisition support. Acquisition support into portfolio operations. Portfolio operations into advisory work for mid-market owners too proud to admit they needed intervention until the alternatives got ugly. That work changed both of us. Not morally. Practically. We learned how ownership moves behind the scenes. How closely held companies become vulnerable. How regional firms with old reputations and weak governance get quietly positioned for sale long before the employees suspect anything. How family businesses survive one generation through devotion and often die in the next through vanity. We also built a real life. That part matters. Because content like this can distort reality if you're not careful. It makes revenge look like the whole story. It isn't. The whole story is the life that keeps happening while revenge, if done properly, takes the long route. We bought a house with an ugly kitchen and good bones. Had a son, Luke, who came into the world with Adam's cautious eyes and my father's brow. Then later, a daughter, May. All questions and defiance and impossible hair. We learned school calendars, mortgage rates, night terrors, science fairs, how to switch pediatricians, how to carry the ordinary exhaustion of a decent life without mistaking it for failure. That grounded me more than grief ever could. Every now and then, I drove through Dayton on work trips and took the longer route past the industrial park. I'd slow near the building and let memory hit where it wanted to. Sometimes the sign looked freshly cleaned. Sometimes one warehouse bay sat dark. Sometimes I saw old employees stepping outside for a smoke and wondered how many of them still thought of my father when they looked up at the office windows. The first year after the settlement, Mercer Industrial Supply still looked healthy. The third, the landscaping had started going soft. The fourth, I heard through an old warehouse manager that Richard had taken on debt to fund a satellite distribution expansion nobody inside the company had asked for. The fifth, a longtime client moved part of their business to a competitor. The sixth, another left completely. The seventh, one of Adam's contacts sent him a quiet note about a mid-sized industrial supplier in Ohio showing signs of owner succession strain and overextended expansion assumptions. The company name on the summary made my heartbeat go slow instead of fast. That was how I knew I was ready. Excitement is sloppy. Calm is expensive. I didn't act yet. That is the difference between emotional revenge and structural revenge. Emotional revenge lunges at the first weakness. Structural revenge waits until timing stops being symbolic and starts being profitable. Over the next 2 years, I gathered information without waving my own history around like a flag. Former employees called now and then, not dramatically, just the way old men in supply businesses call when they want to tell you something and preserve their dignity at the same time. Things aren't as steady as they used to be. Richard's chasing volume without margin. He lost the Patterson account. There's talk about refinancing. Morris retired. That last one mattered, because honest accountants leaving family businesses is rarely good news. At year 8.5, Adam brought home a preliminary lending review tied to a regional distressed industrial portfolio. He didn't hand it to me over candlelight like some movie husband delivering fate. He set it down on the kitchen island between juice boxes and unopened mail, while May argued with Luke about whether hamsters had knees. That's real marriage. History sliding quietly between homework and dinner. The portfolio included Mercer Industrial Supply. The summary was almost offensively neat. Owner overreach. Weak succession structure. Stress debt. Undervalued in pressured sale conditions. In other words, Richard had finally converted my father's stability into a balance sheet flimsy enough for the market to punish. I stood there in my kitchen reading those lines while pasta boiled and my children fought about Parmesan. And I thought, with perfect clarity, there you are. Not Richard. Timing. That was what I had been waiting for. Adam and I did not leap. We worked. That part never gets enough respect in these stories. People love the moment where the enemy finally realizes who you've become. That moment matters. But if you don't earn the math before it, the scene is just theater. So we ran the numbers. Real estate value. Inventory distortion. Recoverable client base. Debt load. Operational inefficiency. Customer concentration risk. Supplier vulnerability. Exit possibilities. Management replacement assumptions. Capital needed for stabilization. We talked to advisors. Quietly. Structured interest through an acquisition vehicle rather than my own name. Again, boring, necessary. The idea was not to make my uncle sweat early. The idea was to let the process age in his blind spot. By year 10, the company was weak enough to be acquirable, but still alive enough to be worth saving. That is a narrow band. Too early, and you overpay for someone else's ego. Too late, and you buy a corpse with nostalgia attached? When the formal process opened, it did so exactly the way these things always do, quietly, blandly, almost disrespectfully. Conference rooms with bad coffee and over-aggressive air conditioning. Men in navy suits saying strategic alternatives when they mean somebody has finally run out of room to lie to the lender. Data rooms. Inventory schedules. Receivables aging summaries. Environmental reviews. Lease language. Capital stack questions. I did not present as the daughter returning home. That would have been sentimental and expensive. I presented as what I had actually become. A serious operator with capital. Restructuring vision. And no appetite for overpaying to soothe someone else's self-image. If Richard suspected the interest was mine, he gave no sign. From what I later pieced together, he thought the likely buyer was a regional consolidator. Good. Let him. He had spent 10 years underestimating me out of habit. I saw no reason to cure him before signatures. The deal closed on a Tuesday morning. Gray sky. Cold wind. Everything outside appropriately unimpressed. No violins. No heavenly light. No catharsis handed down theatrically from the weather. Just signatures. Lender notices. Control transfers. Escrow confirmations. And that deep internal stillness that arrives when something you have imagined for so long finally happens and reveals itself to be made mostly of documents. B9, 17A. M. The acquisition entity controlled the company. B10, 40. Operating authority had transferred. B11, 5. I was sitting in my car outside the building, staring at the same brick facade I had watched for years from a distance. The air smelled like diesel, wet leaves, and the thin metallic edge of coming snow. Adam called just before I opened the door. You ready? No flourish. No speech. That's why I married him. I looked at the building and said, not in a healthy way. He laughed softly. Then his voice gentled. Remember what this is. I rested one hand on the steering wheel. It's not about hurting him, right? It's about returning the company to the right story. Yes. That sentence steadied everything. When I walked into the lobby, the receptionist looked up and blinked twice. Denise. Still there. Still, with the same careful posture and stiffly perfect handwriting I remembered from my 20s. Hannah? I smiled. Good morning. Her eyes shifted to the legal folder in my hand, and then to the suited counsel beside me. The atmosphere changed instantly. That is another thing people misunderstand. The satisfying part of revenge is not always the confrontation itself. Sometimes it is the room recognizing structure before anyone explains it. The tiny, electric second, when people realize the script they've lived under is no longer in force. Is Richard expecting you? Denise asked. No. I said. That's the nicest part. She picked up the phone with hands that were trying not to look shaky and called upstairs. I heard my own name. Then legal. Then here. Good. Let those 3 words travel ahead of me. The office upstairs looked smaller than memory had kept it. That happens with stolen places. Once fear leaves them, the proportions change. Richard's office sat in the same corner my father's used to occupy. But he had renovated badly. Darker wood, heavier leather chairs, abstract art trying too hard. My father had liked light. A clear desk, straight lines, things that looked like work. not power. Richard had turned the room into a stage set for a man performing significance to himself. He was standing behind the desk when I entered, one hand flat against the surface, the posture of someone trying to feel solidity through furniture. For 1 second, he looked genuinely old. Not senior. Old. Because power ages terribly when paperwork changes sides. Hannah, he said. Just my name. No niece. No smile. Interesting. I set the acquisition packet on the desk between us. You should have received the notices. He didn't touch them. This is some kind of misunderstanding. It is always that first. Not ownership. Not consequence. A misunderstanding. No. I said, it's a transfer. He stared at me, then at the packet, then back at me. You've been behind this? Yes. A short laugh escaped him. Disbelieving. Offended. With whose money? That question told me he still thought scale was masculine by default. I smiled slightly. May own. And people who know how to read a weak operator. That landed harder than any accusation could have. Because men like Richard would rather be called greedy than incompetent. He sat down slowly, as if his knees had become unreliable. This company survived because of me. I looked around the room, at the leather chairs, the dark shelving, the expensive desk, the pen still lying where my father would have kept it. Then at Richard. No, I said. It survived despite you. Silence. Clean. Useful. He tried a different angle. Your father wanted me here. There it was. The moral shortcut. I leaned forward just slightly. My father trusted you while he was dying. I said, that is not the same thing. His mouth hardened. You have no idea what those years cost me. No. I said, I know exactly what they paid you. He opened the packet then, flipping pages fast. Too fast for a real reading. Scanning for survival points. Transition language. Authority transfer. Board restructuring. Building control. Signing limits. Interim advisory option. There are few sounds more satisfying than expensive paper going sharp in a man's hands, because he has realized none of the pages belong to him anymore. When he reached the signature page, he went still. That was what I had waited 10 years for. Not his apology. Not his anger. Recognition. The precise moment a thief understands the room is no longer available to his version of events. You planned this? He said quietly. For 10 years. I did not say it proudly. Just accurately. Accuracy was the whole point. Then I reached into my bag and placed one more thing on the desk. A duplicate of my father's original founding photo. The black and white one from the truck. The one Richard had reduced to lobby decor while revising the caption underneath into something vague about transition leadership. This goes back downstairs. I said, with the correct caption. He stared at the photo longer than he had stared at the transfer packet. That interested me. Maybe shame was in there somewhere after all. Not moral shame. Historical shame. The kind people feel when a lie they've lived inside too long suddenly gets reflected back at them without any flattering light. You're enjoying this? He said. That question revealed everything he still didn't understand. No. I answered, I'm finishing it. There's a difference. Enjoyment is emotional. Finishing is structural. He asked what happened next in the brittle, careful tone-stripped men use when they are trying to locate some surviving corner of control. Who stays? Who goes? How long? Whether he has room to negotiate. Whether the lenders could be persuaded to reconsider. Whether I intended to humiliate him publicly. Whether there was any chance of a private family arrangement. I gave him exactly what the documents allowed. 30-day advisory option subject to approval. Immediate loss of signing authority. Transition coordination. Building access by schedule. Nothing vindictive. Nothing generous. That is another thing people romanticize incorrectly. They imagine real revenge means throwing someone out in a single theatrical burst. Usually the stronger satisfaction is quieter. A revoked password. A key card that no longer opens the same door. A name removed from a memo. A receptionist copying someone else first. He stood when I turned to leave. Hannah. I looked back. He had aged another 5 years in 10 minutes. What do you tell yourself to make this feel righteous? The question was so revealing it almost softened me. Not enough to matter. I held the door and answered with the truest sentence I had. That it isn't about righteousness. It's about returning the company to the right story. Then I left him there. In the office, he had borrowed from grief and mistaken for inheritance. The rest of that day was not cinematic. It was work. Real work. Emergency vendor calls. Leadership introductions. Staff meetings. 2 crying employees in private corners because regime change. Even necessary regime change is still destabilizing to people who just want payroll to continue and the shelves to stay stocked. I didn't float through it like some avenging ghost in heels. I took notes, asked questions, mapped risk, read immediate reporting, reviewed account health, corrected 3 false narratives before lunch, stabilized what I could. That mattered, because my father had built the company for employees and customers, not for a family myth. If I bought it back only to make the ownership story feel emotionally satisfying, I would have betrayed him again. By late afternoon, my legal counsel had gone. Denise had stopped looking like she was about to faint. And word had already traveled through the warehouse with the weirdly efficient speed working-class men reserved for leadership changes and storms. An old inventory manager named Carl approached me near the loading bay. He had worked for my father since I was a teenager. Same heavy gait. Same nicotine-stained fingers. Same instinct to remove his cap in emotionally significant moments. He stood there for a second and said, "Your dad would have liked the way you did this." That nearly undid me. Not because it was poetic, because Carl never said anything he didn't mean. By the time the building emptied, dusk had turned the lot outside, blue-gray, and the warehouse smelled even more like memory than usual. Oil. Cardboard. Cold concrete. And the faint sweetness of dust warmed all day by machinery. I stood alone in one of the side aisles for a minute, looking at the shelves. The labels had changed. The systems had drifted. Some of the operational discipline my father used to carry in his body was gone from the place. And still, under all of that, it was there. The building remembered him. Grief lives in architecture when you've loved someone practical enough. Adam found me there about 15 minutes later. He had stayed nearby all afternoon on purpose, but never once hovered. He came down the aisle with his coat over one arm. Tie loosened. Face tired. "You okay?" I looked at the shelving. Then at him. "No." I said. Then I laughed softly. Yes. That was the right answer. The rebuilding took 3 years. People love the walk-in scene. They should. It was earned. But the part that mattered most came after. When the building no longer cared about symbolic justice and needed actual leadership, we sold dead inventory, rebuilt supplier trust, renegotiated terms, updated systems, closed one overextended distribution experiment. Richard had nearly bankrupted himself defending out of pride. Brought back 2 older employees he'd pushed out because they remembered my father too vividly to be convenient. Restored discipline. Not glamorous. Necessary. I replaced the lobby plaque 6 weeks after closing. The new one read, "Founded by Daniel Mercer." 1987. Built on reliability, honesty, and work that outlasts ego. I stood there while it was mounted and felt something in me unclench that had been tight since the day my father died. He was not back. That was never the fantasy. But he was no longer disappearing on paper. That had been the promise. As for Richard, he took the advisory window for 11 days. 11, not 30. He spent most of them trying to position himself as irreplaceable institutional memory, which would have been almost funny if it weren't such a perfect continuation of who he'd always been. He kept implying that the company's relationships still ran through him. They didn't. Not enough to matter. His usefulness had always been overstated by proximity and underwritten by my father's actual competence. Once those myths were removed, what remained was a man with decent sales instincts, poor financial discipline, and a talent for mistaking inherited access for earned authority. We let him leave with dignity. Not closeness, not restored trust. Dignity, more than he had ever extended us. He asked once, toward the end of that short transition, whether we could have lunch as family after things settled. I looked at him across the conference table and realized something important. He still believed time converted theft into complexity. It doesn't. It just gives people more chances to dress it better. I declined. Not angrily. Clearly. And that was that. My father's company is not what it was in 1998. It shouldn't be. Businesses that survive honestly evolve. We expanded where the numbers supported it. Cut what was vanity. Invested where durability actually mattered. The company is healthier now than it was in Richard's final years. Profitable. Respected. Boring in the good way. The kind of business my father would have trusted. People ask sometimes whether buying it back healed me. No. It clarified me. Healing had already started years earlier. When I stopped needing my uncle to admit what he'd done in order for it to count as real, buying the company back didn't create peace. It aligned the paperwork with the truth. And sometimes that is enough to let grief sit down finally. My uncle stole my father's business while he was dying. 10 years later, I walked into his office as the new owner. People hear that sentence and imagine the triumph lives in the doorway. It doesn't. The triumph lives in the decade. In every room where I learned what men like him never imagined I would understand. In every contract I learned to read faster than charisma. In every year I chose competence over drama while he mistook my silence for surrender. In every ordinary Tuesday, where I kept building a life strong enough to finance the ending, he had never bothered to fear. That was the revenge. Not the walk-in. The becoming. If this story stayed with you, subscribe before you go. There are more of us than anyone admits. People whose grief became someone else's leverage. People who watched a smooth relative rewrite a good man before the obituary language was even dry. People who learned too young that signatures can steal what fists never could. And if that's you, remember this. You do not always need to destroy the person who wronged you. Sometimes it is enough to outlast him, outgrow him, and then walk calmly back into the room he mistook for his. My father asked me not to let my uncle make him disappear. He almost did. Then I came back with the signature page. And this time, the building remembered the right name.